As of July 2023, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has entered into its 17th month. What the Kremlin had initially intended to be a quick knockout blow toppling the Ukrainian government in a matter of days has transformed into the bloodiest war fought in Europe since 1945, and the Russians have since shifted their strategy from a blitzkrieg-style offensive into a long war of grinding attrition. As a part of this war of attrition, the Russians are systematically attempting to annihilate the Ukrainian economy in order to destroy its ability to effectively fight back and force a surrender. Ukrainian infrastructure like roads, railways, bridges, energy facilities, and more have been relentlessly bombed by cruise missiles and explosive kamikaze drones. Explosives planted within the Novokokhovka Dam in southern Ukraine blew the dam apart and flooded large sections of the Dnipro River downstream, and wrecked much of southern Ukraine's irrigation systems. Across the front line, the Russians have planted enough landmines to make Ukraine the most heavily mined country in the world now, that could take decades of time and effort to fix. And then, there's simply been the numbers of people who have left from the Ukrainian economy altogether and are no longer contributing to it. The latest numbers suggest that around 3.7 million Ukrainians, 90% of whom are women and children, continue to remain outside of the country as refugees, along with an estimated 42,000 civilian deaths since the invasion began. And militarily, the United States believes the Ukrainian side has so far suffered around 20,000 military deaths and 130,000 additional injuries. And in addition to these losses in people within Ukraine, there's also been the loss of land. As of the production of this video, in the midst of a massive Ukrainian military counteroffensive, around 18% of Ukraine's internationally recognized territory remains beneath Russian military occupation, an area roughly the size of Austria stretching across the Ukrainian provinces of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea. All provinces that Russia has since unilaterally declared to have annexed into its own territory, in the largest conquest of land seen in Europe since the Second World War. All of this has resulted in the Ukrainian economy contracting by nearly a third from the beginning of the invasion in February of 2022 to a year later in February of 2023. But one of the biggest ways that Russia has been attempting to destroy the Ukrainian economy even further has been by using their navy to blockade the country's coastline in an attempt to strangle Ukraine's ability to conduct maritime trade with the rest of the outside world. Russia's initial invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014, and subsequent full-scale and ongoing invasion that began in 2022, has resulted in the majority of the Ukrainian coastline already falling beneath direct Russian military occupation, with many of Ukraine's most significant ports unable to be used or accessed. The entirety of the Sea of Azov has been fully occupied on all of its sides by Russian forces, leaving Ukraine with only a small amount of remaining coastal access in the west of their country. But even this limited coastal access to the world's oceans has been severely restricted by the actions of the Russians. The city of Kherson, another major Ukrainian port city on the Black Sea at the mouth of the Dnipro River, was directly occupied by the Russians for months across 2022 before being retaken by the Ukrainians in November. Then, in June of 2023, the Russians blew up the Novokokhovka Dam further upstream, which resulted in the port facilities of Kherson becoming severely flooded and damaged. The reservoir that was behind the blown-up dam has largely drained up, impairing shipping and navigation all along the Dnipro River south of the city of Zaporizhia. And, moreover, much of the Dnipro River's east bank south of Zaporizhia remains beneath Russian military occupation. That mostly eliminates the ability of Ukraine's Dnipro River ports to continue functioning with exports and imports, including river ports further upstream like Dnipro and Kiev. This means that, for the most part, the current situation in Ukraine has left the Ukrainians with really only 7 maritime ports that are still available and viable to use to import and export goods from: Mykolaiv, Yuzhny, Odessa, and Chornomorsk, directly on the Black Sea itself, and Kilya, Ismail, and Reni within the interior on the Danube River that connects into the Black Sea. However, ever since the invasion began, these have been the ports that the Russian Navy has been the most concerned with actively blockading, which has reduced Ukraine's ability to actually use them. Moreover, in order to dissuade a potential Russian amphibious assault on the beaches near the highly strategically valuable ports of Odessa and Mykolaiv, the Ukrainians chose to cover the sea nearby with a thick layer of naval mines. sanctions, which has exacerbated these ports' abilities to conduct regular civilian maritime trade as well. From February of 2022 to July of 2022, the Russian naval blockade of Ukraine's remaining ports here was extremely tightly enforced, and prevented nearly all of Ukraine's maritime exports from being able to leave the country, and imports from being able to enter the country. This resulted in massive volumes of Ukrainian grains and agricultural products getting trapped with nowhere to go, sitting in silos nearby to the coast, unable to be exported to markets around the world that desperately needed them. That was an extremely dangerous situation for the entire world, because under normal circumstances, Ukraine is one of the most significant agricultural producers in the entire world, and a lot of countries heavily rely on their food products to continue effectively functioning. You see, Ukraine is a land that is blessed with some of the most agriculturally fertile soil seen anywhere in the world. It contains the highest concentration in the world of a very specific soil type called Chernozem, or black ground, which has a very high moisture storage capacity and naturally contains high amounts of ammonia and phosphorus. The Chernozem soil type is considered so valuable for agriculture that it was illegal to sell in Ukraine for decades until just a few years ago in 2020. Under normal circumstances then, before the invasion, Ukraine was the world's leading producer of sunflower oil and a globally important top 5 producer in grain crops like barley, maize, and wheat. Before the invasion began, approximately 15% of the worldwide corn market was contributed by Ukraine, along with 13% of the global barley market and 10% of the global wheat market. Many of Ukraine's enormous agricultural products went to food-vulnerable countries around the world, and fed an estimated 400 million people, most notable among them probably being Egypt. With extremely limited farmland around the narrow Nile River running through the Sahara Desert, and with an exploding and hungry population of more than 110 million, Egypt currently imports roughly half of their entire consumption of wheat from abroad, and a quarter of those wheat imports were all coming from just Ukraine, with another 62% of those imports coming from Russia. The Russian invasion of Ukraine thus severely disrupted the supply of wheat to the country, as the Russian naval blockade was blocking all of Ukraine's wheat and other food supplies from getting out of port, meaning that at least 12% of Egypt's entire normal wheat consumption was trapped in Ukrainian grain silos, unable to make it out. The price of bread and other foods in Egypt and around the world began to spike, as the usual supply became constrained, leading to widespread fears of public unrest emerging within particularly food-vulnerable and inflation-sensitive countries across the Middle East, like Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon. During these initial months of the Russian naval blockade, Ukraine was left with very little other alternative options of getting its usual agricultural exports out to the world market. The only really remaining methods were by either rail or truck, but both of those methods are vastly less efficient than shipping out by sea for a variety of reasons. Part of the problem is that all 15 countries of the former Soviet Union, including Ukraine, still use a different rail gauge than the rest of Europe does. You see, nearly 2 centuries ago, back in 1843, the Tsarist Russian Empire decided to select the 5-foot or 1,520mm gauge as their standard railway gauge across the whole of their empire. The Soviet Union then inherited this decision after it was established in the early 1920s, and maintained and expanded it all throughout its existence, which is why all formerly Soviet states continue to use this gauge for their own railways today. But of course, this gauge contrasts with a so-called standard gauge railway of 1,435mm, which is the most widely used railway gauge in the world today, and the one that is used in nearly the entirety of the rest of Europe, including, critically, in all of Ukraine's European Union member bordering states like Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. This means that freight rail transport from Ukraine to other post-Soviet neighboring states like Russia, Belarus, and Moldova is much easier because the tracks are the same gauge and so no changes have to be made at the borders. But Ukraine is currently at war with Russia and Belarus, so that kind of eliminates that possibility. In order for Ukrainian freight trains carrying grains to go west into the European Union, they have to stop at the border and spend time transferring the grain containers off of the larger Soviet gauge cars and onto the smaller standard gauge cars that can then be used across most of the European Union's rail network. And trucks are even less efficient because they simply have more limited volumes they can transport at a time. They take longer and they consume more fuel, meaning that they simply cost more than transporting anything by rail or by sea. Railways and trucks ultimately did help to move some of Ukraine's globally important grains out of the country, but they would never be able to economically move the same kind of volumes that Ukraine's usual maritime-based transportation was capable of. Just before the invasion began, Ukraine's Black Sea ports were exporting around 60% of Ukraine's entire agricultural export. But after the invasion began and the coastline became blockaded, the situation got so bad so quickly that by May of 2022, Lithuania was publicly calling for the creation of a naval coalition of the willing that would see ally navies sending their own warships into the Black Sea to safely escort Ukrainian merchant vessels carrying their grains through the Russian blockade. A plan that would have had to be approved by Turkey, and a plan that could have ended in a shooting war between Russia and the Allied warships. But that outcome never came to pass, because after a series of extremely tough negotiations, Russia, Ukraine, and the United Nations finally settled on a deal to get Ukraine's agricultural products out of the country by ship to the places that needed them in July of 2022. It all culminated in what became known as the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was mediated by Turkey, the country who controls the extremely strategic gates regulating all maritime access between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Under the terms of the deal, 3 Ukrainian ports on the Black Sea coast, Yuzhny, Odessa, and Chornomorsk, would each be granted the ability to export grains to the world market through the Russian naval blockade. The Ukrainian merchant vessels carrying the grains from these ports would all be made to assemble here, and then travel along a very narrow and strict corridor 310 nautical miles long by 3 nautical miles wide towards the Bosphorus Strait in Turkey. Once there, the ship's cargo would be subject to inspection by a joint team of Russian, Ukrainian, Turkish, and UN officials. And after passing, the ships would be allowed to carry on their way towards markets. Upon returning back to the Turkish Straits on their way back to Ukrainian ports, the same joint team of Russian, Ukrainian, Turkish, and UN officials would inspect the ship's cargo once again, where the Russian officials would be specifically searching for any weapons on board being taken back to Ukraine. The deal was initially set to last for 120-day terms at a time, after which it would have to either be renewed with the consent of all involved parties, or expire. In some ways, the Black Sea Grain Initiative deal was a success. Its signing directly contributed to the decreasing global price of food around the world, as markets all began anticipating the usually massive Ukrainian grains re-entering the global supply again. Ever since, Ukraine has managed to successfully export around 30 million tons of its grain by sea to date. But the deal has also been far from perfect. Despite the deal being made, Ukraine was still only exporting about 30% less food products than it had been doing before the invasion for a variety of reasons. Under the terms of the deal, the Russians have the right to inspect any Ukrainian merchant vessel they want in order to make sure that they aren't carrying weapons on board back to Ukraine. The Ukrainians have repeatedly claimed that the Russians have been overly picky with this right, and that they have been deliberately dragging out the inspection process on virtually all of their merchant vessels in order to slow down Ukraine's exports. While the deal itself has been repeatedly threatened with cancellation from the Russian side, the very day after the deal was signed, the seaport at Odessa, supposedly one of the safe ports allowed to continue trading, was bombed by Russian missiles and damaged. Russian forces have continued hitting parts of the city of Odessa with missiles and drone strikes ever since. Then, on the 29th of October 2022, the Russians suddenly announced that they were withdrawing from the grain deal altogether, over accusations that the Ukrainians were using merchant vessels within the agreed-upon safe corridor to launch drone strikes against the Russian Black Sea Fleet operating in Crimea. After a few days of frantic negotiations, they were finally convinced to return back to the deal on the 2nd of November, and then they continued tenuously agreeing to renew it every time it came up again, until the 17th of July 2023, when it was set to expire once again. In July, Russia began insisting that it would withdraw from the deal again unless certain demands of it were met first. They insisted that Western financial sanctions placed upon them were restricting their ability to export their own agricultural products like grains and fertilizer. While Russian grains and fertilizer products have never been directly targeted by Western financial sanctions, Russian insurance, logistics, payment, and banking companies all have been targeted. And so, Russia has argued that those sanctions placed a barrier to their own agricultural exports nonetheless. In order to help with this, they requested that the Russian Agricultural Bank be reconnected to the worldwide SWIFT international payment system, a bank that had been severed from SWIFT almost immediately after the invasion took place, which isolated its ability to conduct transfers and payments with foreign, non-Russian companies. Moreover, the Russians insisted that the deal wasn't accomplishing its stated purpose of getting grains to poorer countries that needed them the most. Between August of 2022 and July of 2023, the vast majority of Ukraine's agricultural exports being allowed through the Russian blockade were only going to 6 countries: China, Spain, Turkey, Italy, the Netherlands, and Egypt. 40% of Ukraine's agricultural exports were heading to Western Europe. Another 46% were heading to Asia that was mostly taken over by China and Turkey, while only 12% were heading to Africa. The UN has countered these facts by insisting that the increased supply of Ukrainian grains onto the worldwide market helped to reduce the overall global price of grains by about 20%, which still ultimately helped alleviate food prices in struggling, less developed countries as well. Nonetheless, when the time came for the deal to be renewed again in July, the Russians ultimately decided to not renew it again on their end, and the deal is dead for now. The Russians revoked their security guarantees of maritime vessels transiting the previously agreed-upon safe corridor between Ukraine's Black Sea ports and Istanbul, and the full naval blockade of Ukraine's remaining coastline has since gone back into effect, pretty much like it was back during the beginning of the invasion in 2022. Consequently, we should expect food prices around the world to increase once again, as it gets more challenging to get Ukraine's grains out onto the world market, and as China and Western Europe search for alternative suppliers. For their part, the Russians have insisted that they could be convinced to return back to the deal again in the future if their demands are met, like reconnecting the Russian Agricultural Bank back to the SWIFT payment system. And, understandably, owing to Russia's numerous threats over the past year to withdraw from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and due to trust between Ukraine and Russia being at an all-time low, many Ukrainians were long concerned that the grain deal would not end up lasting forever. Contingency plans had to be made for this likely future scenario to mitigate the risk. And one of the best plans the Ukrainians have come up with here is to rely more on their previously neglected and largely unused 3 river ports on the Danube River, in the extreme southwest of the country. The Danube River itself is the second longest river on the European continent. It arises within the Black Forest of Germany before snaking across the territorial borders of 10 European countries until it empties at its delta in the Black Sea between Romania and Ukraine. Thanks to numerous engineering efforts across the 19th and 20th centuries, the Danube is today a highly navigable river. Ocean-going ships are able to enter its mouth in the Black Sea and travel as far inland as the Romanian river port of Brăila, and then river barges can make it even further all the way inland to Kelheim in Germany, a distance of over 2,400 kilometers away from the Black Sea. And then, due to a series of canals the Germans constructed during the 20th century, river barges can then connect from the Danube River at Kelheim to the main river at Bamberg, and then from there on into the Rhine River and towards the Rhine's delta at the port of Rotterdam, the biggest port in Europe and the biggest port anywhere in the world outside of Asia. A continuously navigable route by river traffic and barges all the way across Europe, from the Black Sea to the North Sea, that was only finished in 1992. Ukraine has 3 significant river ports on its section of the Danube River, in a remote part of the country known as the Budjak, which is administratively a part of the Odessa province. This means that, hypothetically, grains transported down to these 3 river ports by rail or by truck can then be loaded up onto ships and either transported downstream the Danube into the Black Sea, or further upstream the Danube and then through a series of canals towards major Romanian ports like Constanta. And if the situation within the Black Sea got really bad enough with the Russian Navy, under an extreme scenario, they could be transported all the way upstream the river to Kelheim and moved through all of the canals towards the Rhine and towards Rotterdam, or loaded up onto trains and taken to any number of European ports all along the way. But this strategy was initially considered geographically problematic, because these 3 Danube River ports and the region of the Budjak itself is only tenuously connected to the rest of Ukraine, and is nearly a completely separate island from Kiev's perspective. The Budjak region is only connected to the rest of Ukraine by 2 roads and 1 railway. And of these limited connections, the M15 highway in the west stretches through Moldovan territory and runs less than 23 kilometers away from the territory of Transnistria, a breakaway state within Moldova that has requested annexation by Russia on multiple occasions, is currently occupied by at least a couple thousand Russian soldiers, and is legally considered by the European Council to be a Russian-occupied section of Moldova. Hypothetically, Russian troops stationed within Transnistria are only a stone's throw distance away from striking the M15 highway nearby. The other highway and rail connection from the Ukrainian mainland to the Budjak region is a highway and rail combo running side by side of each other across a bridge over the Black Sea through the town of Zatoka, a bridge that is very vulnerable to missile and drone strikes. This strategic bridge has already been documented to have been attacked over a dozen times now by Russian forces since their invasion of Ukraine began, And every time the bridge gets damaged, all Ukrainian traffic into and out of the Blockade region has to switch to using the single M15 highway running partially through Moldova and near to Transnistria, which often results in massive traffic jams stretching all the way from the Danube river ports to the city of Odessa. If both of these roads get severed, then the Blockade region effectively becomes an island of Ukraine's from a logistical perspective. Because of this remoteness from the rest of the country and the difficulties in actually transporting anything to them, compared to Ukraine's comparatively massive ports that are directly on the Black Sea, these three Danube river ports of Ukraine were long neglected and only accounted for around 1.5% of Ukraine's total volume of trade before the invasion. By contrast, Ukraine's numerous Black Sea ports accounted for a whopping 60% of Ukraine's entire trade volume, with most of the rest being made up by rail and trucks. But since the invasion began, with the loss of their entire eastern coastline to Russian occupation and the imposition of a Russian naval blockade across the remaining western coastline, the importance of the once neglected Danube river ports in the extreme southwest of the country became immediately apparent. While they may indeed be more logistically difficult and expensive to get to, the Danube river ports offer a major advantage during wartime that the Black Sea ports do not: safety. The port of Mykolaiv wasn't even ever subjected to the security guarantees of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and has been frequently subjected to aerial attacks. Odessa was covered by the terms of the deal, but was still repeatedly subjected to missile and drone strikes regardless. And now that Russia has announced its total withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative altogether, all bets are off again, and all of the Black Sea ports will return back to the full blockade and potential attack scenario. All of Ukraine's Danube river ports are very notably directly on the border with Romania, a European Union and NATO member state. Were the Russians to try and bomb those river ports with missiles and drones, they stand a chance of missing their intended targets and striking Romanian territory by mistake, which could hypothetically lead to a scenario where Romania chooses to invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which would bring every single NATO member state, including the United States, into a direct war with Russia. That ultimately means that the Russians aren't very likely to attack these Danube river ports unless they're very confident, very dumb, or potentially both. And moreover, these Danube river ports grant the Ukrainians the ability to export their grains upstream the Danube into safe Romanian territory, and through canals to Romanian ports like Constanta, where they can then continue on across the Black Sea through Istanbul and on towards global markets, while imports can follow the exact same route in reverse. What would the Russians be capable of doing to stop all of that from happening? Blockade the Romanian coastline as well? A blockade of a NATO member state? Resort to unrestricted warfare in the Black Sea, sinking or boarding every Ukrainian merchant vessel they can find anywhere outside of territorial waters? Both are doubtful decisions, because both would greatly escalate the risk of a greater conflict erupting between Russia and NATO. And then, even if the Russians did choose either or both of those options, Ukrainian merchant vessels could take the painfully long but still plausible route all the way through the Danube and canals to Rotterdam and the North Sea on the other side of Europe, and avoid the Black Sea region altogether. So, recognizing all of this, the Ukrainians began rapidly developing these Danube river ports almost immediately when the Russian invasion began. More than $100 million worth of public and private investments have been poured into them since the invasion began, while salvaged equipment from other captured or blockaded ports in the country have been transferred over whenever possible. Of these investments, one of the most critical since the invasion began was the dredging up of the Bystra Canal here, resulting in an increase of the canal's depth from 3.9 meters to 6.5 meters, causing the canal to be navigable to larger ships and traffic. This project was met with notable environmental criticism over concerns it would negatively impact the Danube Delta's wildlife. But all of that was sidestepped by the Ukrainian government out of a wartime necessity. By doing so, merchant vessels waiting to enter into the Danube River from the Black Sea were cut by 2/3, and there's still active discussion of increasing the Bystra Canal's depth even further to enable even larger ships to access it. Now, Ukrainian imports can enter the Bystra Canal and unload at the safe Danube River ports by Romania, while Ukrainian exports can do the same. Load up on ships at the Danube River ports and then exit through the Bystra Canal near Romania, and then exit through the Bystra Canal near to Romania. And if they really need to, they can travel further upstream the Danube to safer Romanian ports or other European ports. And as a result, the Danube River ports have risen dramatically in importance to the Ukrainian economy, going from accounting to just 1.5% of Ukraine's total trade volume before the invasion began to well over 20% of Ukraine's total trade volume today, including a quarter of Ukraine's entire agricultural exports. Exports of Ukrainian grains upstream the Danube through the Romanian river port of Galati are up a whopping 90 times, compared with the volume seen only a couple of years ago in 2021. Right before the Black Sea Grain Initiative expired, Ukraine's Black Sea ports were still accounting for about another half of all the country's agricultural exports, while the other quarter of exports were getting out by rail and truck. But now that the deal has been cancelled and the ports are returning back to a full blockade scenario, those half of Ukraine's agricultural exports are either going to be trapped within the country indefinitely, or the Ukrainians are going to have to find another way to increase their ability to move products out of the Danube River ports or out by rail and truck. So now the importance of Ukraine's Danube River ports have gotten to a level they have never seen before, and the clock is ticking for Kyiv to develop them even more. It is the best method that their geography grants them to get around the return of a full-scale Russian naval blockade across the rest of their remaining coastline. It seems like ever since this decade began, there's been a nearly constant stream of bad news to keep all of our attention fixed on our smartphones. For the few minutes we have every day when we're not doing anything and waiting around, whether we're waiting for a class or a meeting to start or waiting for the train or the Uber, we tend to almost instinctively fill them up now by checking through Twitter or scrolling through TikTok or some other way of passing the time that gives us a bit of dopamine, because we think that there's not anything productive or meaningful that we can possibly do in those quick 5 or 10 minute slices of life. But over time, all of those 5 or 10 minute chunks spent waiting around really start to add up. So rather than wasting them, you can use them to learn something new and valuable. That's the key idea behind this video's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is a STEM learning platform that designs these amazing interactive courses that take big and complex subjects like computer science, physics, or statistics, and breaks them down into smaller bite-sized chunks that you can learn at your own pace. You might only learn a small bit of statistics or physics in 5 minutes, but once you keep with it for long enough, filling up your occasional free 5 minutes with them, they begin to all add up together into a meaningful understanding of a subject you might have previously thought was impossible for you to really learn. I really think it's so cool that they allow you to get that satisfying feeling of achieving a challenging goal just by using the little free moments that you already have. And the best part is that anybody can learn on Brilliant regardless of their prior educational background, because they have extremely clear visualizations and explanations that then let you learn by doing through interactive challenges. So whether you're just beginning your learning journey in a new subject you're excited about, or you're a seasoned expert wanting to brush up, you can try everything that Brilliant has to offer totally free for a full 30 days by clicking the button that's here on your screen right now, or by visiting brilliant.org/RealLifeLore. And on top of that, the first 200 of you to do so will get an additional 20% off discount of Brilliant's annual premium subscription. And you'll also be greatly helping out RealLifeLore while you're at it. And, as always, thank you so much for watching.